January 1944, Normandy, France. The wind bites through the dense fog, and the thunder of artillery erupts in the distance. The faint scent of gunpowder lingers in the air as American soldiers, covered in dirt and exhaustion, dig into the wet earth for shelter. But amidst the chaos, there is something else, something far beyond the scope of their enemies' expectations. Above the battlefield, the B-17 Flying Fortress rumbles across the sky, its engines roaring, the sunlight reflecting off its metallic body. Below, German soldiers raise their heads from their foxholes, staring at the sight of something they cannot comprehend. A new kind of war is being fought, one where the balance of power has shifted, and the weapons are unlike anything they've ever seen. In the heart of the chaos, a group of German officers, recently captured, are escorted to an Allied military camp. Their eyes dart nervously as they pass rows of soldiers, all of whom seem to understand something their captors do not. America's war machine has become unstoppable. The officers exchange confused glances, unable to grasp the magnitude of what they are facing. The sheer scale of American technological advancement is beyond their comprehension. These are not the same forces they've faced in the past. They've encountered bombs, bullets, and steel. But this is something entirely new. And it will change everything. The world had been teetering on the edge of chaos for years. The storm clouds of war had gathered since the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in the early 1930s. By 1939, Europe was in flames. The German Blitzkrieg, a strategy of rapid and overwhelming assault, had proven devastating, allowing Nazi forces to conquer Poland, Denmark, Norway, and much of Western Europe in a matter of months. The rapid victories made the German war machine seem invincible, its tactics sophisticated and brutal, overwhelming the slow and cumbersome forces of the Allies. America, however, remained on the sidelines of this global conflict for much of the war's early years. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had inherited a nation still reeling from the Great Depression. Isolationism prevailed within the American public, many unwilling to be drawn into another European conflict. Yet, as the war raged on, the U.S. began to shift its position. The German threat was undeniable, and the horrors of the war had begun to spill over the Atlantic. The tide began to turn in December 1941, when Japan, an Axis power allied with Germany, attacked Pearl Harbor. The surprise assault brought the United States into the war, and Roosevelt declared war on Japan, followed shortly by a declaration against Germany. The American industrial machine, which had long been dormant, roared to life. Factories that once produced consumer goods were repurposed to manufacture war supplies at an unprecedented scale. It was during this time that the U.S. began to tap into its technological advantage. With resources mobilized on a scale previously unseen, America set about not just fighting a war, but winning it through innovation. Engineers and scientists, many of whom had once been isolated from the realities of war, were now tasked with creating weapons that could tip the scales in favor of the Allies. They had no idea just how much their efforts would change the world. The development of radar, for instance, would allow the Allies to detect incoming German bombers long before they could strike, turning the tide of aerial combat. The B-17 Flying Fortress, a symbol of American engineering, was designed to be an airborne fortress, capable of delivering devastating bombings over enemy territories with unmatched precision. But this was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, in top-secret labs and research facilities, the real revolution was taking shape. The development of the atomic bomb and other classified weapons that would forever alter the landscape of warfare. While Germany had once been the technological leader in military innovations, they were blindsided by America's rapid advancements. The Nazis were entrenched in old ways of thinking, relying on brute force and conventional tactics. Their military leadership, especially in the early years, failed to predict the shift in power that was occurring across the Atlantic. As the United States mobilized for war, a quiet revolution began to unfold within its military. The nation's scientific and technological communities, once isolated and focused on civilian applications, suddenly found themselves at the heart of the war effort. The government threw enormous resources into the development of new technologies that could turn the tide in the Allies' favor. Among the most significant breakthroughs was the Manhattan Project. Secretly launched in 1939, Its goal was to develop an atomic bomb that could outmatch anything the Axis powers could produce. Spearheaded by brilliant minds such as Robert Oppenheimer and Enrico Fermi, this project would not only change the course of the war, but reshape global politics forever. In addition to the atomic bomb, America's scientists and engineers developed a range of other secret weapons, each designed to give the Allies an unassailable advantage over the Axis. But these developments weren't just confined to the laboratories and testing grounds. The U.S. military began integrating these technologies into their existing forces, pushing the boundaries of what was possible on the battlefield. The American military's development of the B-17 Flying Fortress, for example, marked a dramatic shift in how air warfare was conducted. Unlike the nimble but fragile bombers used by the Germans, the B-17 was heavily armored, capable of withstanding enemy fire while delivering devastating blows to the heart of Nazi infrastructure. Radar, another American innovation, provided a critical advantage in the skies and on the seas. The ability to detect enemy aircraft or ships before they reached American territory, or ships, gave the U.S. Navy and Air Force an upper hand, especially during the Battle of the Atlantic and the Pacific Theater. It was an invisible shield, allowing the Allies to track and neutralize enemy forces from miles away. These advancements came as a shock to the German High Command, who had spent the early years of the war focused on refining their tactics and honing their technological advantages. They believed that their superiority in tanks, aircraft, and artillery would be enough to secure victory. But what they failed to see was that warfare was changing, not just in tactics, but in the very tools used to fight it. German officers, in particular, found themselves baffled by the sudden appearance of American technological superiority. When they were captured and taken prisoner during the latter stages of the war, many were left speechless by the technology they encountered. It was no longer a matter of strategy and tactics alone. America's secret weapons had completely redefined the rules of war. As American forces pushed further into Europe, the consequences of this technological shift became apparent. German forces, despite their best efforts, could not match the speed, precision, and destructive power of American weaponry. Even the mighty Wehrmacht, once thought to be an unstoppable force, found itself unable to keep pace with the innovations unleashed by the United States. For the German officers captured during the latter part of World War II, the realization of America's technological superiority was both shocking and humbling. Many of these men had been battle-hardened veterans, accustomed to the relentless pace of the war and the brutal nature of the fighting on the eastern and western fronts. They were trained to anticipate enemy tactics, to read the signs of an impending attack, and to outmaneuver their opponents. Yet, nothing in their training had prepared them for the sheer scale of technological power wielded by the Americans. When they found themselves behind Allied lines, either as prisoners of war or captured during skirmishes, they were faced not just with soldiers, but with an entirely new type of warfare. The machines of war, the B-17 bombers, the radar systems, the high-powered artillery, seemed to have a mind of their own. There was no human element to anticipate, no predictable behavior. The officers who had once commanded the terrifying might of the Luftwaffe, or the men who had led panzer divisions across Europe, could do little but stare in stunned disbelief at the weapons arrayed before them. Their defeat had become inevitable, not because they lacked the will to fight, but because they had failed to foresee a revolution in how wars were fought, one in which technology, rather than sheer firepower, would decide the outcome. The shift in tactics brought on by America's new weapons reshaped the entire battlefield. The Germans had relied on the blitzkrieg strategy, a rapid, coordinated assault of infantry, tanks, and airstrikes designed to overwhelm and outpace the enemy. The power of this tactic had been demonstrated in the early years of the war, as the Wehrmacht quickly stormed through Europe with a sense of unstoppable momentum. However, America's secret weapons forced a change in how warfare was approached. The B-17 Flying Fortress, for example, was a game-changer in aerial combat. It was no longer enough to have fast and nimble bombers. The Americans had developed bombers that were able to fly higher, carry heavier payloads, and, most importantly, were armed with multiple layers of defensive weapons. The B-17 could take multiple hits and still complete its mission, often returning to base, with the crew still alive. This technological shift required new defensive tactics. The Germans, who once had the upper hand in air combat, now found themselves struggling to deal with an enemy that could bomb their cities, infrastructure, and military installations with impunity. The speed of their armored divisions was no longer enough to outpace the constant bombardment from the skies, and their strategy of quick ground assaults became increasingly ineffective against an adversary that could strike at any time, from anywhere. Technological angle. The secret weapons that emerged from America's military-industrial complex were like nothing the Germans had seen before. The radar systems, in particular, proved to be one of the most formidable technologies. By detecting enemy aircraft before they could strike, the U.S. military had a clear advantage in battles, such as the Battle of Britain and the Pacific Air War. The radar allowed Allied forces to track German aircraft from miles away, providing crucial time for defensive maneuvers and counterattacks. The atomic bomb, however, was the crown jewel of America's technological arsenal. Though it would not be used until the war's final days, its existence had been enough to shift the course of history. For the German officers, the idea of a weapon capable of ending an entire city in the blink of an eye was inconceivable. It was a weapon of mass destruction so advanced, it made all other military strategies seem obsolete. The Germans had their own weapons of mass destruction, but they could never have dreamed of something with such devastating power. The American military leadership, recognizing the strategic importance of technological advancements, quickly integrated these innovations into their broader military strategy. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe, understood that technological superiority could decisively tip the balance of power. Under his leadership, the U.S. military's industrial and scientific advancements became a central element in the Allied war effort. Eisenhower's vision went beyond traditional battlefield tactics. He understood that innovation and new technology could achieve what brute force alone could not. Similarly, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz in the Pacific and General H.H. Arnold in the air campaign pushed for the use of the most advanced technologies available. Nimitz's decision to use radar to track Japanese movements and Arnold's focus on the strategic deployment of B-17s and B-29s reflected the military's embrace of technological solutions to warfare. American leaders saw the war not just as a contest of armies, but as a contest of innovation. The American command structure was flexible enough to quickly adopt these new weapons and tactics, understanding that victory would not come simply from ground forces, but from a combination of technological power, efficient logistics, and strategic leadership. This adaptability became a key strength of the American war effort, allowing them to stay several steps ahead of their German counterparts, who were more traditional in their thinking. Enemy angle. For the Germans, this technological shift presented a deep crisis. Under Hitler's regime, military strategy had focused on speed and overwhelming force. The German High Command had always placed a premium on fast, decisive victories, and had little time for the lengthy research and development of advanced technologies. Their early successes were the result of tactical ingenuity and a superior understanding of battlefield dynamics. They believed that victory could be won through the sheer will of their soldiers, who were indoctrinated with Nazi ideology and discipline. But when faced with the technological edge of the Americans, this approach was rendered ineffective. German officers, particularly those who were captured or made prisoners of war, were stunned by the precision and power of American weapons. They had faced the might of the American military before, but the advent of weapons like the B-17, long-range bombers, and radar turned the tide against them in ways they had not anticipated. The Germans were left playing catch-up, developing their own jets and advanced rockets like the V-2, but it was too little, too late. Their attempts at technological innovation could not overcome the scale and integration of the American war machine. Moral angle. The use of such advanced weapons brought a moral dilemma that had never been faced on such a large scale. On one hand, the technological advancements provided the Allies with the ability to end the war more quickly and decisively, saving countless lives by forcing the Germans to surrender before more destruction could take place. On the other hand, the destructive power of these weapons raised questions about the ethics of warfare. The atomic bomb, in particular, presented a new kind of moral quandary. It was capable of erasing entire cities, leaving a long-lasting scar on the people it touched, both physically and psychologically. As American forces advanced across Europe and the Pacific, the impact of these weapons was felt in ways that went beyond the battlefield. For the German officers who survived, the realization that they were up against weapons of such unimaginable power must have been both demoralizing and frightening. They had fought in a war where the rules of engagement were slowly being rewritten by technology, and they understood that they were fighting a losing battle, not just against enemy soldiers, but against an industrial and scientific force that was beyond their grasp. The decisive turning point came in the summer of 1944, during the Allied invasion of Normandy. Operation Overlord was in full swing, and the beachhead at Utah, Omaha Gold, Juneau, and Sword Beaches became the scene of one of the most pivotal battles of World War II. While the infantry struggled to establish a foothold above them, the skies were filled with the sound of B-17 flying fortresses, B-24 Liberators, and fighter escorts. These massive bombers, laden with hundreds of bombs, streaked across the English Channel, their targets clearly defined in the German defenses along the beaches and inland fortifications. The German military had anticipated the land assault, but they were unprepared for the unrelenting aerial bombardment that supported the American troops. German radar systems, still in their infancy compared to their American counterparts, were overwhelmed. The B-17s, with their reinforced armor and powerful weaponry, could withstand hits from enemy aircraft and anti-aircraft fire, completing their missions without losing their effectiveness. The result was a devastating blow to German positions. Entire battalions were disoriented, scattered, and wiped out before they could engage in any meaningful counterattack. The moment that encapsulated the technological shift came on June 6, 1944, D-Day. As German officers in the field watched, helpless against the precision and firepower of the American bombardment, they began to realize that they were no longer fighting a conventional war. The air supremacy held by the Allies, bolstered by superior technology, was unmatched by anything the Germans had. The superiority was not just in the size or power of the weapons, but in the way they were used, coordinated, precise, and relentless. It wasn't just the aircraft or bombers, it was the radar systems, which could detect and track German movements miles before they were visible to the naked eye. It was the ships, equipped with advanced communication systems and radar, to coordinate strikes far more efficiently than the Germans had ever been able to. The American war effort was an amalgamation of technology and strategy, creating a synergy that made the German forces appear antiquated and disjointed. In the aftermath of D-Day, many of the German officers who were captured couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. As they were brought into Allied custody, their first words were often questions about the American secret weaponry, unable to fathom how such technological advancements were integrated into a force so rapidly and efficiently. The German officers, seasoned veterans of battles in France, Russia, and North Africa, found themselves confronting an entirely new kind of adversary. Their tactics, honed over years of brutal conflict, were no longer sufficient to overcome the overwhelming technological might of the Americans. As the Allied forces pushed further into France and across Europe, the technological gap between the German and American forces became impossible to ignore. The Germans, who had prided themselves on their innovative use of tanks and air power, found themselves outclassed at every turn by the advancing American war machine. What had once been an enemy they could outmaneuver with their superior speed and efficiency was now a formidable force that combined cutting-edge technology, overwhelming manpower, and strategic precision. The pivotal moment came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Germany, in one last desperate attempt to push back the Allies and retake lost ground, launched a counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest. The battle, which would become one of the largest and bloodiest of the war, was meant to catch the Allies off guard and split their forces. Yet, once again, the Germans found themselves up against an adversary they could not understand. American forces that could communicate faster, strike harder, and deliver an unrelenting blow from the air. The Americans were ready. The German attack was met with superior air support, and the Allies quickly adapted to the shifting front lines, using advanced radar systems to track German troop movements and anticipating the next strike. While the German tanks pushed through the forest, the skies above them were filled with American fighters and bombers. The coordination between ground and air forces was seamless, something the Germans simply could not replicate with their own war machine. The turning point of the Battle of the Bulge came not just from the soldiers on the ground, but from the overwhelming technological superiority that allowed the Americans to respond faster and more effectively. German officers, who had once been confident in their ability to control the battlefield with their panzer divisions, now realized that they were outmatched by an unseen force. The American ability to strike at any point, anywhere, at any time. The desperate German attempts to deploy advanced weapons, such as the V-2 rocket, came too late. These long-range weapons, while impressive, lacked the precision and overwhelming scale of American technology. The Germans had developed advanced jets like the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, but it was no match for the American air superiority gained through the sheer numbers and technical superiority of their bombers, fighters, and radar-guided systems. The turning point was clear. Germany had no answer for the technological might of the United States. As German officers were captured, they could only stare in disbelief at the precision and scale of the American military operation. They had fought against traditional forces, against tanks and infantry, but the future of warfare lay in a new dimension, one defined by technology, coordination, and speed. Their defeat was no longer a matter of strategy or tactics. It was a matter of a technological revolution they couldn't comprehend. The immediate aftermath of D-Day and the subsequent battles in Normandy, such as the Battle of the Bulge, marked a decisive turning point in World War II. For the German military, the shock of realizing that their opponents wielded such advanced technology was profound. The defeat they had suffered was not just a loss of men and equipment, but a complete collapse of their ability to fight in a war where the rules were changing in real time. German soldiers, once confident in their tactics and technological prowess, now faced an enemy that could outmaneuver them, outfight them, and most terrifyingly, outtech them. Captured German officers, who had once commanded battalions of tanks and aircraft, were now forced to acknowledge the reality. America's secret weapons had made the difference. They could no longer rely on their traditional strategies. The sheer scale of American technological advancement had outpaced them in every aspect of warfare. Air superiority, artillery precision, and intelligence gathering through radar and other advanced systems. The American war machine, built on a foundation of mass production, technological innovation, and strategic foresight, continued its march across Europe. The Allies, with their technological edge, began liberating countries from Nazi control at an unprecedented pace. The German High Command, deeply shaken by their losses, could not recover. Their attempts to use advanced weapons like the V-2 rocket and the jet-powered Me-262 were simply too little, too late. These weapons, while revolutionary, lacked the scale and integration of America's vast technological superiority. The German military had no answer to the American ability to coordinate a full-scale assault from the air, the sea, and the ground. In the months that followed, as the Allies moved deeper into Germany, the nature of warfare had fundamentally shifted. The German officers who had once led with confidence now stood as prisoners of war, their final moments of command marked by the realization that they had been outclassed by an opponent who had leveraged innovation to achieve victory. The capture of these officers became symbolic, not only of Germany's defeat, but also of the revolution in warfare that the United States had unleashed. In the broader scope of the war, the consequences of Germany's defeat went far beyond the battlefield. The collapse of the Nazi regime was inevitable after the Allies, propelled by technological superiority, broke through the German lines and captured Berlin in May 1945. The loss was not only a military one, but a catastrophic blow to the Third Reich's ideology, which had once considered itself the pinnacle of technological and military innovation. For the United States, the aftermath of the war was a moment of profound transformation. The weapons that had been developed in secret, radar, advanced bombers, and eventually the atomic bomb, cemented America's position as a global superpower. The world witnessed the birth of the Cold War, a new geopolitical struggle where the technological gap between the U.S. and the Soviet Union became central. The atomic bomb, in particular, signaled that the age of conventional warfare had come to an end. The global order would now be defined not by armies on the ground, but by the threat of annihilation from weapons of unimaginable power. The knowledge that America's technological edge had contributed significantly to the Allies' victory became a cornerstone of the post-war era. The United States didn't just emerge as a military powerhouse. It emerged as the leader in scientific and industrial innovation. This shift had profound effects on global politics, economics, and even cultural perceptions. American technological superiority became synonymous with military strength and international influence, shaping the policies of the Cold War era. Meanwhile, the German defeat marked the end of a once promising technological race. While the Nazis had made some significant advances in rocket technology with the V-2 missile and the Me-262 jet fighter, these were ultimately the last gasps of a dying empire. The Germans' failure to fully exploit their technological potential during the war was a key factor in their defeat. They were simply outpaced by the scale, coordination, and mass production capabilities of the Americans. The Nazis had hoped that their advanced weaponry could tip the balance of the war, but the Allies' superior technologies, honed through collaboration, industrial strength, and innovation, had already shifted the tide of battle. In the immediate aftermath, Germany was left in ruins. The war had devastated its cities, its economy, and its military infrastructure. It was a shell of the formidable power it had been just a few years prior. As the country began its slow recovery, the question of how they had fallen from the heights of power to total collapse lingered. The technological gap between Germany and the United States had played a critical role in their downfall, and it was a lesson they would never forget. For the captured German officers, their role in the war was now reduced to one of reflection. As they stood before Allied interrogators or faced the judgment of the post-war tribunals, they knew they had been on the losing side of not just a conflict of ideologies, but of an entirely new era of warfare. The war had been lost, but it had been lost to a new force, one that was not defined by tanks, soldiers, or strategy, but by the power of technology. The realization was stark. They had not just fought against the Americans, they had fought against an advancing tide of innovation, and that was a battle they could never win. The aftermath of World War II marked a pivotal moment in human history, a moment where the landscape of warfare, power, and global influence was irrevocably changed. The Germans, once at the forefront of technological advancement in warfare, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer scale of American innovation. It wasn't simply the weapons themselves that changed the course of the war, but the shift in how wars would be fought from that point forward. The revolution was not only technological but conceptual. What had once been a battlefield dominated by manpower, tactics, and the physical might of armies was now being shaped by machines, intelligence, and precision. America's victory, driven by the power of radar, the B-17, and the atomic bomb, signaled the dawn of a new era. An era where the fate of nations would no longer be determined by armies alone, but by the technologies they wielded. The secret weapons that had been developed in the shadows of wartime research became symbols of America's ascent as a global superpower, a role it would hold for much of the 20th century. The advent of nuclear weapons, in particular, would forever alter the nature of warfare, introducing the world to the terrifying possibility of total annihilation. For the German officers, the end of the war was not just a military defeat, but a confrontation with the inevitability of progress. They had fought against an enemy that seemed out of reach, an enemy whose technological superiority had turned the tide in every theater of battle. The war was lost not just because of strategies, leadership, or the will to fight, but because of a fundamental shift in the tools of warfare. It was a lesson that could not be ignored. In the future, wars would be fought not just with soldiers and guns, but with technology that could reshape the world in an instant. Looking back, the conflict of World War II can be seen as the last of the wars, where brute force alone could carry the day. From this point forward, the battlefield would be defined by innovation. The captured German officers who once commanded tanks and aircraft now understood that the power of the future lay not in traditional weapons, but in the ability to harness new technologies that could change the game before the first shot was even fired. This shift in how wars are fought, the fusion of science, industry, and military power, was not just a victory for the Allies. It was a victory for human ingenuity, for the idea that innovation could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. The war had ended, but the lessons learned in its wake, lessons in the power of technological supremacy, would resonate through the Cold War and beyond, forever altering the course of history.